This is Garrick Zoeter, the clarinet professor at the Shenandoah Conservatory here in Winchester, Virginia. And I'm back again to play through and help you with the 2026 Clarinet Prepared Etude for your All-State audition. And so we will sort of progress in the manner that we have in the past with these videos. I'll start by playing the etude for you, or in this case, the first 24 measures, which is what you need to play. And then afterwards, I'll come back and give you my advice on how to best succeed in your audition. So here we go. Okay, so now you've heard me play the first 24 measures of this etude, which are the 24 measures that you will need to play in your performance when you do your All-State audition. And so now I will give you some thoughts and some helpful hints that will hopefully help you to play the music to the best of your ability. This year, as was the case last year, we have a piece that was actually originally written for another instrument. This study, even though it appears in the Rose 40 studies for clarinet, is actually a piece written for the violin, as was the piece that was last year's piece to play for the audition. And so what I usually suggest to my students is go ahead and listen to that version, the original version, and then, take from that original version some ideas that you can put into your performance on the clarinet of this version. However, in this case, after listening to a few performances this morning on YouTube of the violin version, I wouldn't really suggest you listen to it. Most of those performances are not very good. So if you want to listen to it, you certainly can, but it's not something that in this case I think you have to do. All right, so let's talk now about the clarinet and the playing of this etude. I think when you do an audition, you want to think about what this etude is trying to show, or what you should be showing through this etude, and therefore what the judges are going to be listening for when you play the piece. And so we can divide these ideas, or these different things that you need to focus on, into different categories, right? So the three sort of categories that I've broken this etude into are rhythm, articulation, and the style, right? This etude is quite repetitive, so there's not a lot of sort of complex issues in any of these categories this year, but there are certainly things that you should take into consideration, because I think the rhythm, articulation, and style are the three things, or the three sort of categories that you need to show your strengths in when you do this piece, when you play this piece. All right, so why don't we start by talking about the rhythm, right? When we take a look at this etude, the good news is that we see pretty much 5 different rhythmic figures throughout the passage you need to play. So there are not really more than 5. What do we have? We have sextuplets, we have groups of 2/8 notes, 4/8 notes, we have groups of 4/16. We have one little section in measure 7 where we have a dotted 16th followed by 30 seconds. It only happens in that measure. We also have, we have quarter notes, and that's pretty much it. So there's not a wide variety of rhythms that you need to play. So for instance, once you've mastered measure 1, you've mastered measure 3, right, rhythmically. Once you've mastered measure 2, you've mastered measure 4 rhythmically. Measure 5, measure 6, exact same rhythms in those measures, right? So the good news is you only need to master a rather small amount of rhythmic divisions of the beats in order to really play this piece well, okay? So that's really good news. So rhythmically speaking, again, the tempo marking is moderato, quarter note equals 100, not too fast. As you heard in my performance, I think I stuck to that metronome marking pretty well. Sometimes in the past I went a little too fast, but I think this time I actually got it. So not faster than quarter note equals 100. You can start from a slower tempo and then gradually work your way up to the faster tempo. Rhythmically, that's really all you need to do in this piece, is simply master those patterns like we talked about: sextuplets, eighth notes, 16th notes, groups of 4/16th notes, and you should be good to go, right? Don't rush. The tendency will be to want to rush the sextuplets. You will want to rush the groups of 4/16ths, and you may also want to rush the third and fourth beat of measure 7, where you have the dotted 16th going to the 32nd. Try not to rush those. Really work with the metronome to make sure that you don't go too fast, okay? So if you do that, if you do those things, your rhythm should be quite secure and you should do very well in that category, okay? Now, let's talk about the articulation, because as always seems to be the case with the etudes that are selected for this audition, the articulation is always a major, major, major part of it. And I know certainly from the number of students that have come to me over the years, the first question they say is, how do I tongue better? How can I get my tonguing better? So I know that articulation and tonguing on the clarinet is a major issue for pretty much everyone who plays the instrument, right? Me included. So let's take a look at the articulations that you find in the etude, right? Basically, they break down into two categories: staccato, or short and light, and non-staccato, notes without a dot, right? So if we look at the first measure, we see eighth notes with the dot. If we take a look at measure 5, for instance, we see eighth notes without a dot, right? So one of the things you need to do in this etude is to differentiate the articulations between the staccato notes, which should sound quite short, and the other eighth notes, which should sound a little bit longer. Now, I know I told you not to listen to the violin version. However, there is something from the string playing that we can take in this regard, and that is that the eighth note passages that do not have a staccato on them, you can think of as bowing the notes. In other words, they should sound longer than the shorter, more separated notes that you find in measure 1, measure 3, etc., throughout the entire piece, right? So you need to show that variation between these notes. And there is one place in particular in this etude where, if you don't look carefully, you might not notice that there is a variation. And that is, for instance, the downbeat of measure 2 in measure 1, the downbeat of measure 2 in measure 3, the downbeat of measure 2 in measure 5. What am I saying? In other words, the note immediately after the sextuplet in this etude is long. There's no dot on it, right? So in other words, the D in measure 1, after you play the sextuplet, is long. And I tried to show this, or rather exaggerate this a little bit in the performance I did. Hopefully you could hear that. So you're going to play that eighth note, downbeat of second beat of measure 1, and every case after that, longer, and then immediately switch to the shorter eighth notes after that. So you get this ya, da, 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 ya, da, 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 da kind of sound, rather than mistakenly playing the eighth note on beat 2 of measure 1, measure 3, etc., short, where it's actually marked long. So be careful of that. That's a little bit of a pitfall. When I worked on the piece this morning, I immediately saw that and realized, oh, I've been playing that too short. It should actually, those notes should actually be long. So be careful of that. Okay, the other thing we need to think about when tonguing is the use of the air, right? I think it's a very good idea to think of your tongue as being part of the air, not separate from the air, right? So in other words, when you're tonguing, you want an airstream that is very much like this, right? And your tongue is a part of that airstream. In other words, the air pushes forward through the tonguing sections, right, of which there are numerous ones in this piece, and that is what allows each of those notes to speak, right? You want to think about this and try to incorporate that, right? So when you tongue notes, you're using a lot of air behind them, a lot of air direction, a push of the air along with the motion of the tongue. That's going to allow most of these notes to speak. Why do you need to do that? You need to do that because notes on the clarinet range from very resistant, i.e. the notes where you put down all the fingers, right? And then notes that are not resistant. For instance, an open G, which is not resistant. F, E, D here, not resistant, right? So you have combinations of notes, or rather arpeggiated figures in this piece, where you go from resistant notes to not resistant notes. And that can be very difficult when we're tonguing notes. We have to realize, for instance, looking at measure 1, that the D and B on the second beat are very resistant. And if we don't have enough air going with our tonguing, those notes won't speak. Conversely, the open G and the D, which fall in beat 3 of that measure, are not resistant. So if you hit those notes with the same amount of air that you did the previous 2 notes, they might split, they might squeak on you. So you have to figure out and keep in mind this rule. When all the fingers are down, or for instance, D, E, F, right? You're playing notes in what we would say the right hand, so to speak here. Those are very resistant. As we go into the left hand notes and to the open notes, B flat, A, G, the notes are less resistant. So with your tonguing, you have to make sure that you figure out, okay, I need to push more air on these resistant notes and perhaps a little bit less air on the less resistant notes. As a result, the listener will hear that all of those notes are tongued exactly in the same manner. And they don't hear a huge burst of sound, or they don't hear notes that don't speak. So that's something very important to consider, okay? Good, all right. So the other thing about articulation really quickly, and you know, we can talk hours about this, so I can't get into it too much here, is that where you put the tongue on the reed is very important, okay? If you have a private teacher, you can consult with your private teacher to talk about, you know, where the most ideal placement is on the reed. It's different for everybody, although in general, you perhaps want to stay away from tonguing at the very tip of the reed. This is something I see often, and it usually doesn't work very well. Again, I don't want to tread on any toes with you know, teachers that you might have that suggest this. So if it works for you, do it. However, also try tonguing a little bit lower down, perhaps on the reed. Find the place where that works optimally. You'll have to experiment quite a bit in order to make that work best for you. Okay. That's the articulation. Now we come up to the final category, which is basically the style of the music, right? So chiaramente is what's written in the first measure, which actually, I guess, translates to the word clearly. Now in this case, that's not really that helpful, I don't think. So I'm thinking of different words at the beginning of the piece. I'm thinking of like the word buoyant, with humor, lightness, that kind of idea. That's what I'm thinking. That doesn't have to be what you're thinking. But what is most important is that you do think about it, right? So come up with your own character, right, of what you think the piece is like. What is the character of this music? Is it funny? Is it sad? Is it happy? Is it light? Is it heavy, right? And write that in your music at the beginning. So it's the first thing you see before you start playing, right? That'll set you off on the right path in terms of what the character of this music is, okay? All right, now let's talk just a few technical details. There's really one technical detail in this piece that I should go over for you all, and that is what to do with the turns that we find in measure 16 and in measure 14. So measure 14 and 16. What you see there is an A with a turn that then goes to the C sharp, right? So we have throat A going to C sharp. Now, if you use the regular fingering, right? That's kind of cumbersome, right? So what I suggest is to use a fake fingering for B. What is that fingering? Well, it's the throat A plus the top side key, right? So if we do that, we get a B, which is pretty well in tune, right? So for instance, if we look at measure 14, go slow, that allows us to execute the turn easily and without the cumbersome nature of, which is a lot harder, right? So top side key plus the A key gives you the fake B and allows you to execute the turn in measure 14 and in measure 16 successfully. So yeah, that's the major technical element of this etude. We don't really have any left-hand Cs going to right-hand E flats like we usually do in these etudes. So that's kind of the major technical difficulty that I think many of you, especially those who don't have a private teacher, might encounter, right? So listen to that section, go back, listen to it over and over again, right? Until we figure out, okay, A, the top side key over here is what gives us the B and allows us to do that turn in the most effective manner. Okay, let's talk about the accents, right? There's a lot of places where there are accents. In fact, usually it's the beginning of the sextuplets. Sometimes it happens on quarter notes, like the low G before 10, the low G before 6, and the final note of the section that you need to play for the audition is also accented. Be careful not to over accent them. If you do, you will run into the problem of probably squeaking on those notes. So use a lot of energy, but feel it out and make sure that you're not overblowing on those accented notes. The accents at the beginning of the sextuplets is a little more problematic, especially on the clarinet. Again, if you do listen to the violin version, you will hear that most violinists, play that accented 16th at the beginning of the sextuplets on the longer side. So ya-dee-da-da-da-da, which I tried to do in measure 1. I didn't do it after that because I kind of was thinking to myself that I'm not quite sure that works so well on the clarinet. It can result in an uneven sextuplet, or it can sound like an uneven sextuplet. So I leave it, again, if you have a private teacher, I leave it to you to discuss that with your teacher, whether or not you want to lengthen the accented note on the sextuplets or not. My suggestion would probably be not to do that. Just because it sets you off in a rhythmically unstable way, and it doesn't sound quite as good on the clarinet, or it doesn't work quite as well on the clarinet as it does on the violin. So that's something, again, you can discuss with your teacher or your band director, wind ensemble director, orchestra director. They can certainly help you with that as well. They can listen to you play it and say, well, I kind of like it better this way, or it sounds rhythmically more stable this way, okay? All right, and the last thing to talk about in this piece really are the breath marks. So you see there's a breath mark at the end of measure 2, there's one at the end of measure 4, there's another one at the end of measure, measure 8, measure 12, right? These are not necessarily places to breathe. They are places that you probably will breathe, but I'm not sure that the breath mark is there because of that. I think it's actually there to tell you that you can take a little bit of time before you come in to the next entrance. And this is not such a bad thing because it allows you to set the next sextuplet in a very nice and confident manner rather than sort of rushing into it, which could happen, right? So I think it's okay to go ahead and take a little bit of time on those quarter note rests and then go on and play your sextuplets. It's also, playing that way is also a big part of the style of the music in terms of the time period that this violin piece was actually written in, right? So it's kind of sort of a rubato marking in a way, yeah? Okay, I think that's probably it for today. If you have any questions, you can always email me at gzoeter@su.edu. If you live nearby, or if you would like to come play for me sometime, this music before you do your audition, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And yeah, I would love to see you and to hear you play. Okay, so good luck to you all, and I wish you the greatest success in your audition, and take care. Bye.